Morning, everybody. The usual set of announcements. Incidentally, once again, if you're having difficulty hearing me, wave a hand or something, draw it to my attention. There is the handout, which is actually all that the handout is the lyrics for Abdullah Bulbul Amir. So it's hardly a matter of crucial importance, but it seems to have had a checkered career through the processing department, and apparently it might be here today. It doesn't matter if it isn't, but if it is, well and good. Anyway, I'm just telling everyone not to get concerned about it. I've been asked to announce that there's a film tomorrow at 11:30 on Florence Nightingale. Now, of course, tomorrow we are doing the Crimean War, and Florence Nightingale, of course, is relevant to that. And I think, I haven't seen this film either, but apparently it slightly debunks the mystique of the lady with the lamp, which is no bad thing, because I think it's probably a myth that needed debunking. And lastly, can I just remind you again about phones? If anyone has not yet switched theirs off, this is a good time to do so. Right. On Monday we covered 2,500 years. Yesterday we covered 250. Today we've only got to do 80. So this is becoming better economy in terms of years per minute. Yesterday I finished by describing the Crimea as a nirvana of fruitfulness, friendship, and free spirits. And in my own mind's eye, having spent 1 week there, I think of it as perched between blue skies and blue water, lush vegetation tumbling between imposing villas down to the water's edge, more or less as on the picture in front of you. However, the reality is that for most of Crimea's history, right up to the present day, it's been remorselessly brutal, bleak, and inhumane. And in Russia, the whole of post-Romanov politics got off to a chaotic and bloody start, but in the Crimea just as much as everywhere else. Let me just put it into context for a moment. In March 1917, 300 years of Romanov rule came to an end when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and his place was taken by a provisional government headed by a 37-year-old lawyer named Kerensky, who curiously came from the same small provincial town as Lenin. In fact, Kerensky's father had been Lenin's headmaster. And Kerensky's government, as you know, was overthrown. Many of you have been attending the lectures on the Bolshevik Revolution in the afternoon, which covers this period very well. And Kerensky's government was overthrown itself in a coup d'etat 6 months later by the Bolsheviks. And 3 months after that, the supporters of the new government, whom we usually call the Reds, were at war with a sort of ragtag mixture of opponents who are usually known as the Whites. Now, the Crimean Tatars, who remember were then about a third of the population, thought that this looked like a good opportunity to regain their lost independence. The trouble was that there were immediately 3 Crimean Tatar groups claiming to be the legitimate government. One of them called in the Germans to their aid. Now remember, this is January 1918. The war is still in full fling. It has another 10 months to run. So one of them called the Germans in to their aid. Now experience should have told them that this was a very bad idea. and the Germans needed a port from which to transport the Ukrainian grain, which they were commandeering, so they were only too willing to come into the Crimea, which they overran and executed all the Bolshevik leaders immediately. However, in November 1918, so in other words, the Crimea was under German occupation for 6 months, and then in November 1918, the war ended and the Germans were called home. And one of the white generals took over control. Here he is, General Antonin Denikin, and he took over control of the Crimea from the Germans. But as soon as the Germans leave, the Red Armies enter the Crimea from the north, and they proclaim the Crimean Soviet Socialist Republic. And here it is, and I just showed it to you because it's interesting that in 1918, the flag, this is the flag that they designed, doesn't look like a masterpiece, but it's got, you know, the lettering is in both Roman and Cyrillic. And they had the support, the Bolsheviks who entered the Crimea from the north, they had the support of the Black Sea Fleet, who had drowned their officers in Sebastopol by throwing them overboard with weights attached to their feet. And Prince Yusupov, who became famous as the assassin of Rasputin, as you may know, who was taking refuge in the Crimea at the time, he wrote, "A diver sent down to explore the bottom of the bay went mad at the sight of the corpses standing upright, swaying in the currents." And it's a hypnotic image, but you have to remember that Prince Yusupov was a notorious fantasist and liar. I was surprised to learn that the first leader of the Crimean Socialist Republic was Dmitry Ulyanov. That name ring a bell? He is the younger brother of Lenin. Now, I knew about Lenin's elder brother, Alexander, whose execution in 1887 for involvement in a plot against the Tsar is usually credited with launching Lenin on a career of revolutionary politics. But having taught and studied this subject for 50 years, I didn't even know Lenin had a younger brother. Anyway, here he is, emerging briefly as the president of the Crimean Soviet Socialist Republic. Actually, almost equally surprising about Dmitry Ulyanov is that he survived all Stalin's purges and died peacefully in his bed in 1943 at the age of 68. Perhaps even Stalin didn't dare to liquidate a Lenin. Meanwhile, the Crimea was filling fast with refugees fleeing in panic from Bolshevik retribution. And the best known of these refugees was the group surrounding the Dowager Empress, who had been, in other words, Nicholas II's mother. And she had been born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, but when she married Tsar Alexander III, she took the name, as was the custom, Maria Feodorovna, and she became a much-loved empress. After her son's abdication in March 1917, the authorities ordered her to move to the relative safety of the Crimea. And there she was joined by a growing number of royalty and aristocrats, most of whom were not on speaking terms with each other. And when the war ended, the British government began to get seriously alarmed about the fate of the imperial family. And why they were worried about this was because Princess Dagmar was the sister of Queen Alexandra of England, who was the widow of Edward VII. This all makes sense? So they began to get worried about the fate of this royal relative. And so Queen Alexandra wrote to her sister, "Darling Minnie, have just been informed, this is sort of telegraphic communication, have just been informed it would be most advisable for you to leave at once before more complications and horrors. Make up your mind before too late to come to me here in England at once. Bring everybody you want. To which the Empress replied, "Darling Alex, thank you with all my heart for your dear telegram. Though I long to see you awfully, see no real reason to leave now for the moment. Loving Christmas wishes to you all." So, on March the 18th, 1919, with the Bolshevik armies already working their way down the Crimean Peninsula, in other words, they'd crossed the land bridge into the Crimea and they were working their way south, another officer was sent to persuade Maria to abandon her stand, but had to telegraph back, "Empress declines to leave." Finally, King George V lost patience and ordered the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean fleet to embark the Russian royal family, whatever may be their personal desires, and remove them to a place of safety. So, eventually Maria was persuaded to come on board, provided that the British promised to rescue all the loyal people in that area. Well, the HMS Marlborough had been warned initially to expect about 12 refugees. Later, that number was bumped up to 80. However, once they'd promised to rescue all loyal people in that area, the number grew to about 4,600. And here is a photograph, does it come out clearly enough? Of the Empress Maria and the Tsar's uncle, generally known as Nikolasha, on board. They were not on speaking terms, incidentally. Is that slightly obvious? And here they are on board the HMS Marlborough, waiting to be evacuated. So, more ships were immediately sent out to cope with the overflow. And then Empress Maria refused to embark from Yalta harbour because it was too public. So a relay of tenders took the royal party out from a point midway along the Yalta promenade. And actually, there's still a plaque there to record the event, just opposite another memorial to the place where Chekhov set his most famous short story, The Lady with the Lapdog. And finally, it took more than 3 days to load the 80 royal passengers and their 240 tons of baggage. And among the luggage, for instance, were the 2 Rembrandt paintings which Prince Yusupov smuggled out of the villa at Koresh, and on the proceeds of which he lived for the next 10 years. Now, shortly before the evacuation was completed, there was a poignant moment when another British ship collected 400 Tsarist officers from Yalta to take them to where there was still fighting at Sebastopol. And as they sailed past the HMS Marlborough, the Russian officers caught sight of the Empress on deck and immediately snapped to attention and burst into the imperial national anthem. As somebody said, the last time it was offered to a member of the royal family on Russian territory. None of those 400 officers survived. As the Bolsheviks tightened their grip on the Crimea, another 144,000 refugees managed to escape from the Crimea. And when it finally fell to the Bolshevik advance, all those who had the money or the contacts or the initiative had already departed. However, that didn't prevent the new Bolshevik supremo in the Crimea, a violent psychopathic Hungarian called Béla Kun from butchering another 50 to 100,000 on the grounds that they were enemies of the people. The miracle is that what with the war and the fugitives and the executions, that there were any people left in the Crimea. But there was a census in 1926, so we know that in 1926 there were 700,000 people living in the Crimea, of whom Russians made up 45%, the Tartars made up 25%, Germans accounted for 8%, Jews 7%, Armenians 6%. So in other words, 1926, the Crimea is still very much a crossroads and a melting pot. Now, the Crimean Republic, the new Crimean Republic, was directly linked to Moscow. And I'm sure you all know that after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was divided into 17 so-called Soviet Socialist republics. So in other words, there would have been the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, there would have been the Georgian Socialist Republic, and so on. So the Crimean Soviet Socialist Republic was just one of those 17. As I say, it was linked directly to Moscow, and in the next 20 years, it went through the same terrible sufferings as the rest of the USSR. And this is, if you've been following the afternoon lectures, this has been very thoroughly dealt with. At first, the Crimean Tatars were dominant in the new government, but as soon as they showed a hint of independence, they were accused of bourgeois nationalism and shot. And that was a double whammy. To be bourgeois was bad enough, because that meant hostile to working class values. But nationalism was just as bad, meaning you put your own narrow regional interests ahead of the greater good of the Soviet Union. So anyone accused of bourgeois nationalism was in deep trouble. By 1929, and this of course we're now in the era of Stalin, by 1929 Moscow had decided to crush Tatar identity. The Arabic alphabet was banned, replaced by the Cyrillic alphabet. From 1931, mosques began to be shut, and the Muslim mullahs were deported to Siberia or executed. However, just for the record, Islam was not the only faith that was being persecuted, as you know. The Orthodox Church in the Crimea, as everywhere else in Russia, was suspect because it was too closely associated with Tsarism. Priests were deported, churches deprived of their land, their treasures pillaged, and their schools closed down. And sad to say, after the death of Archbishop Tikhon in 1925, there was no serious resistance. And just an interesting little point about Archbishop Tikhon, until the Bolshevik Revolution, Orthodox churches all over the world were subject to the Patriarch in Moscow, just in the same way that Anglican churches all over the world are subject to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Archbishop Tikhon had actually made his reputation as the Bishop of Alaska, because you remember that until 1870, Alaska was part of the Russian Empire. Interestingly, he was the Bishop of Alaska, but he sensibly had his headquarters in San Francisco. Now, if the figures are to be believed, deaths from war, political persecution, and emigration were dwarfed by the numbers who died in the famines of 1921 and 1931. Some say between 100 and 150,000. And as ever, famine fell hardest on the poorest part of the population, who in the Crimea were the Tatars. The Tatars also objected violently to the collectivized farms, which Stalin introduced in the 1930s. So another 40,000 were deported to Central Asia. I mean, I find it quite difficult to believe all these statistics. But what saved the Crimea from becoming totally depopulated was the large number of settlers brought in, including thousands of Armenians and Jews. And Crimean agriculture made a surprisingly rapid recovery. The peninsula was found to be ideal for tobacco growing. And the Soviets, this is, also showed a surprising interest in promoting a champagne industry. Russian winemakers were asked to produce a champagne for the people at prices working classes could afford. This is a new slant on what they call champagne socialism. And a Russian winemaker invented a method of maturing sparkling wine in tanks rather than individual bottles. And the process took 1.5 months instead of 1.5 years. And the result was something called Sovetskoye Shampanskoye. It's the only wine not made in the Champagne district of France which can still call itself champagne, but only in Cyrillic letters. That was the arrangement they came to with the champagne makers of the champagne. And most Westerners find Sovetskoye Shampanskoye too sweet for their taste. But my father, who was born in Russia of a Russian mother, always used to add to it a sugar lump. It's still a big earner, currency earner. And here is President Putin touring the cellars last year after the takeover. However, you will see that Sovetskaya Shampanskaya won the approval of a very famous champagne drinker. We're coming to that later. So, there were a few success stories, but generally, you might wonder whether things could get any worse. And then came the Second World War. In the next lecture, we will see that few areas of the Soviet Union had a more devastating and brutal war than the Crimea. As you know, the Germans invaded Russia in 1941, and one of the first places that they occupied was the Crimean Peninsula. So, the first casualties of Nazi occupation were the 45,000 Jews who were liquidated by the Germans. Next were another 90,000 Russian Crimeans who were deported to work as slave labor. But worst of all, when the Soviets recaptured the Crimea in 1944, and we'll talk a little more about this tomorrow, Stalin accused the Tatars of collaborating with the Germans and ordered that the whole Tatar population, men, women and children, no matter what age or what their physical condition or what their war record, should be deported to Central Asia. And here are the transport trains taking the Tatars away to Central Asia. They were given 1 hour to prepare themselves for deportation, and 3 days later, in 3 days, they deported 190,000 Tatars. Another 30,000 followed in the next 3 weeks. At least 10% died on the journey. One Russian called it a journey of lingering death in cattle railway cars, crammed with people like mobile gas chambers. Death mowed down the old, the young and the weak. They died of thirst, suffocation, and the stench. On the long stages, the corpses decomposed in the middle of the wagons, and at the short halts, where water and food were distributed, people were not allowed to bury their dead and had to leave them beside the railway track. Stalin's loathsome chief of police, Lavrenti Beria, reported to his boss no excesses were committed during the deportation. But interestingly, this shocking exercise in ethnic cleansing so embarrassed the Soviet government that they kept it secret from the Russian public for 2 years. And the land on which the Tatars were resettled in Kazakhstan was totally unsuitable for farming, and many thousands more died. And it was certainly one of 20th century Russia's most terrible episodes. Now, the Tatars were not the only people accused of collaborating with the Nazis. After clearing out the Tatars, Stalin cleared the Crimea of the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Bulgarians. Altogether, about 288,000 people were deported from the Crimea. And what was left behind was an almost exclusively Slav population, about 75% Russian and 25% Ukrainian, and in one sense, that's the foundation for the rest of the story. However, before then, Crimea's next appearance on the world stage was in February 1945. By then, it was obvious that the war was about to end. Although there was the war in Europe, actually, that is, although the war in the Pacific showed no sign of ending yet. And all three wartime leaders were already fixing their sights on making a better fist of the post-war world than had been done at Versailles. This was very much on their minds, that they had to create a better post-war world than the peacemakers had done at Versailles. And so it was decided that a summit meeting was essential. And Stalin claimed that his health ruled out long-distance travel. So the Russians suggested as a venue the resort town of Yalta on the south coast of the Crimea. Now that meant that Roosevelt, who was then 63 years old, here he is, and very ill from multiple ailments, from which he would die 2 months later, had to travel 6,000 miles by ship initially to Malta, then by plane to Simferopol, and then a 6-hour car journey to Yalta. And he was very ill at the time, and this photograph and all the other photographs at Yalta make that quite clear. Churchill, a mere 73 years old, but fighting fit, he had to fly to Malta, and in the process, incidentally, 2 of his escort planes were shot down, so it was touch and go that the conference took place at all. At Malta, he joined Roosevelt, and he went by air and car for the rest of the journey. And Stalin, meanwhile, only 66 years old, went comfortably by train from Moscow to Yalta. Now, Yalta may indeed have been a resort town, but not in midwinter. They were greeted by weather which Churchill's daughter described as lowering clouds that spat rain and a little wet snow. This was Churchill's daughter Sarah, whom you may remember, who married the Austrian comedian Vic Oliver. Do you remember that? Anyway, February is the coldest month of the year in Yalta. Temperatures average 3.5 Celsius. Official photographs make it quite clear how heavily the delegates have to be wrapped against the cold. And Yalta may have looked like the French Riviera, as on my initial picture, but it was described by an American delegate as ground to a rubble, of course, by the fighting that had taken place both to capture it and to recapture it. One of Churchill's aides wrote, "Each house was a roofless shell. The destruction had been systematic, and before the evacuation, the Germans had left no home untouched." Churchill said, "Yes, it's the Riviera of Hades." He claimed, if we had spent 10 years on research, we couldn't have found a worse place to meet than Yalta. It's good only for typhus and lice. And when he boarded a British ship after the conference, his first request was to have his clothes deloused. Now, out of consideration for his health and disability, because you all know Roosevelt was a polio sufferer and he was wheelchair bound, you all know that? Out of consideration for his health and his disability, he was lodged at Livadia. Do you remember I showed you 2 photographs of Livadia yesterday, which is the sort of gracious Italianate palace that Nicholas II built? And Alupka, with its British associations, do you remember that was built by the British architect Edward Law? That was thought to be appropriate for Churchill. And Churchill was actually very pleased with the accommodation at Alupka, where he said even the stone lions looked like him. Stalin took over the Yusupov villa at Koresh. Here are 2 views of the Yusupov villa at Koresh. And when one thinks, it's extraordinary thought. Here are the leaders of the post-war world meeting in the home of the last Tsar. And it's astonishing to think that it was only 27 years ago, that the imperial family had been assassinated. And Prince Yusupov, in whose home Stalin was lodging, was, of course, still alive and would outlive the conference by another 22 years. So what sounds like ancient history and modern history have sort of suddenly overlapped. However, these venues may have been palaces, but the accommodation was far from palatial. First of all the rooms had been bugged in advance by the KGB. I mean, everyone took that for granted. But what these most romantic of villas lacked was toilets and bathrooms. Livadia, for instance, only had 9 bathrooms for 140 delegates. Only Roosevelt and Churchill, of the whole conference, had private bathrooms. Even Stalin had to queue for the toilets. One general wrote, "Next to the war and world peace, the bathrooms were the most frequently discussed subject at the Yalta conference." Here we have them at the table in Livadia. It's still there, or put it this way, a mock-up of the table is still there. And you can see sort of opposite us is Stalin. Can you see him? And then on the right of the picture is Roosevelt, and in the front left is Churchill. International conferences, of course, are required to take big decisions. But in between, there's a lot of eating and drinking and small talk. One of Churchill's aides wrote, "The Prime Minister seems well, although drinking buckets of Crimean champagne, which would undermine the health of any normal man." As I told you, Sovietskoye Shampanskoye did win the seal of approval of a famous champagne drinker. Churchill also insisted on having a bottle of vodka by his bedside to combat typhus and lice, just for medicinal reasons. He also brought 500 cigars to the conference. And Roosevelt, as you know, was virtually a chain smoker. Stalin puffed away ceaselessly on a pipe, so one imagines the air must have been thick with smoke. The conference got off to a frosty start when Stalin took offense at hearing that Roosevelt referred to him as Uncle Joe. Once it had been explained to him that that was actually a term of affection, as in Uncle Sam, the atmosphere thawed. there was much reciprocal hospitality. Churchill's daughter let slip that her father liked a squeeze of lemon on his caviar, whereupon a potted lemon tree dripping with fruit suddenly appeared in the conservatory at Alupka. Generally, amiability prevailed. All parties left Yalta reasonably pleased with the deal that they had struck. But decisions at Yalta and action on the ground were not one and the same thing. First of all, they resolved to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. They resolved to set up a new international organization called the United Nations, and this came into effect 4 months later. And at Yalta, Stalin promised to join the war against Japan as soon as the German war was over. And the bait he was offered were the islands of Sakhalin and Kurli. And can you see those on the map? Sakhalin and the Kurli lines. Now, in the event, it wasn't until 3 months later, in other words, 3 months after the war in Germany ended, and in fact 2 days after the Americans dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, that Russia actually entered the war against Japan. And their intervention was of no military significance at all. But they still claimed Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands on the strength of it. At Yalta, you remember, all parties agreed that in Eastern and Central Europe, liberation would be followed by free and fair elections. This is Eastern and Central Europe. Well, of course, you all know what happened to that. A year to the day after the war ended, Churchill was calling attention to the Iron Curtain, which divided Europe. In other words, no free or fair elections had taken place. And it's difficult not to regard the Yalta Conference as a triumph for the USSR and a defeat for their Western allies. Now, to their credit, as a morale-building exercise, the Soviet authorities immediately decided to restore Sebastopol to its former glories. And here was the curiosity of a city which was only 150 years old, which was being rebuilt for the 4th time. And as far as possible, they tried to recreate the classical grandeur of Catherine the Great's city, mostly Mediterranean-style 3-story buildings with columned balconies and Venetian-style arches. And visitors to Sebastopol today are always impressed by the predominantly white, handsome buildings spread across the ridge overlooking Sebastopol harbour. But let's go on to see what became of the Crimea in the 45 years of Soviet rule after the conference at Yalta. For a start, the old Crimean Soviet Socialist Republic was abolished, and the Crimea was demoted to an oblast, or a province, of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Its population was so depleted that it didn't really merit the status of an independent republic. Before the war, it had been 1.5 million. After the war, it was about 350,000. However, this vacuum did provide opportunities. Settlers streamed back, mostly Russians. Where are the KGB? Mostly Russians, but also 30,000 Ashkenazi Jews and other people of sort of Black Sea origins. By 1958, 13 years later, the population had actually reverted to its pre-war levels. Housing was conveniently available, of course, because 250,000 Tartars had been expelled and their houses were available. along with their farmlands and, in many cases, their livestock. But the second last event of historical importance in the Crimea happened 9 years later. It was only 9 years, but 1954 was a different world, because in March 1953, Stalin had died. And after a short and bloodless power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as his successor. And in 1954, a decree was passed transferring Crimea from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic. And this is all very relevant to what is happening today, or what did happen a year or two ago. And officially, the reasons for transferring Crimea from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic was to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the reunification of Russia with the Ukraine. Secondly, that it was a natural outgrowth of territorial proximity of Crimea to Ukraine, which of course is true, the commonalities of their economies, and the close agricultural and cultural ties between the Crimean Oblast and the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. So those were the official reasons for transferring the Crimea from Russia to the Ukraine. But none of those explanations actually demanded that any change of ownership. All those conditions would have applied no matter who had actually, no matter which republic it had been attached to. And commentators remain baffled by this decision. This is about the only time in history when the Russians have voluntarily given up any land of any kind. Most people say now that it was a whim, or to satisfy a whim of Khrushchev's, who allegedly had a fondness for the Ukraine on whose border he had been born. Now, Khrushchev was a great character, and he provided wonderful copy for news reporters. And you may remember this famous debate which he had with Nixon in Moscow on the occasion of the opening of the American Pavilion at the Moscow exhibition. Okay, all understand the context? So here we are.
Видно, что строители не успели закончить строительные дела, и экспонаты еще, так сказать, не находятся. Вот возможности Америка, сколько она существует лет уже? 300 лет? 150 лет независимости. Вот мы туда скажем, что Америка 150 лет, значит, существует, вот ее уровень. Мы 42 года еще не совершила. Еще нам 7 лет, и мы будем на таком же уровне, как Америка. А в следующий пойдем дальше, вперед. Но мы, когда вас обгоним на разъезде, потом, если хотите, мы можем остановиться, сказать, пожалуйста, за нами, пожалуйста. Вопрос социального устройства. Вы хотите при капитализме? Живите. Это дело ваше, это вопрос внутренний, нас не касается. Мы можем вам сочувствовать, ну что же, раз вы не понимаете, ну живите так, как понимаете.
Mr. Vice President, from what you have seen of our exhibition, how do you think it is going to impress the people of the Soviet Union?
It's a very effective exhibit, and it's one that will cause a great deal of interest. I might say that this morning, I very early in the morning went down to visit a market, and where the farmers from various outskirts of the city bring in their items to sell. I can only say that there's a great deal of interest among these people who were workers and farmers, etc. I would imagine imagine that the exhibition from that standpoint will therefore be a considerable success. As far as Mr. Khrushchev's comments just now, they are in the tradition we learned to expect from him, speaking extemporaneously and frankly whenever he has an opportunity. I can only say that if this competition which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you never concede anything.
Американцы умные люди, мы всегда об этом верили и знали. Ну что, глупые люди не могли бы поднять экономику на такой уровень, которого не достигли. Но мы тоже, знаете, не мух, так сказать, ноздрями бьем. Так шагнули.
You must not be afraid of ideas.
Вот мы вам говорим, вы-то не бойтесь сидеть, а нам бояться нечего, мы уже вырвались из этого, понимаете, положения, когда нас идея не пугает.
Well, then let's have more exchange of them. We all agree on that, right?
Хорошо. Вот. Что, все согласны?
Okay, you get the idea. I mean, Khrushchev was a great character. That's the best clip I've seen of him. There's this famous shoe banging incident which actually never happened. He never did bang shoes, and there's no video existing which records him banging a shoe. So that may be yet another of the great myths surrounding Soviet history. However, Khrushchev, as I say, may have been a great character, but he did have a history of making impulsive and badly thought out decisions. And the decision to transfer Crimea to the Ukraine was probably one of those. And of course, were the inhabitants of the Crimea grateful? No, because 75% of them were Russians. They didn't want to be. The last thing they wanted to be transferred to was to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. But having said that, in the long run, as long as both the Ukraine and Russia existed inside the umbrella of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it didn't really matter that much where the internal borders were drawn. You still took your orders from Moscow, whether you lived in the Ukraine or in Russia. However, now that the Crimea was part of the Ukraine, it was up to the new government to make that decision work. And they did make some efforts. Iron industries were developed in eastern Crimea, chemical industries were developed in the north, and Crimea's chronic water shortage, which is the biggest permanent problem in the Crimea, was addressed by building a canal which connected the river Dnieper to the outskirts of Kerch on the eastern Crimea. Does that show up? Yeah. And that proved to be a major boost for agriculture, especially the mass market for wine. And with stability came a huge increase in tourism, both for leisure and for health, especially at a time when Russian citizens were forbidden to travel abroad. and an average of about 5 million Russians a year flocked to the Crimea. And there are still huge sanatoria, they're very often called, where people came for health reasons and where holidaymakers gathered right throughout the summer. And among the holidaymakers continued to be the new Soviet aristocracy. Not the pre-war nobility, of course, but the top Soviet apparatchiks. And Stalin continued to alternate between patronizing the Massandra Palace, do you remember that one? That was the Loire Chateau, which Alexander III built, and the Yusupov Palace, where he'd stayed during the Yalta Conference. And the Yusupov Palace, the one at Koresh, that has a very strange revolutionary pedigree, because not only was it the last home of Felix Yusupov, the cross-dressing assassin of Rasputin, the so-called mad monk himself, Rasputin, stayed at Koresh on 2 occasions. And the sinister founder of Lenin's secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky, took a liking to the palace, and he was so paranoid that he had underground bunkers built underneath it. And some even say that that was why Stalin chose it as his residence during the Yalta Conference, and certainly he slept in the underground bunkers. On the staterooms above ground, which might have been a little more dangerous, Molotov was allocated rooms. And all this attention at least has the virtue, or has had the virtue, of preserving the palace. And today, it's a luxury hotel, and very well-heeled guests can choose whether you want to stay in the Stalin, Molotov, or Yusupov suite. And just west of Yalta is Arianda, where the first Tsarist palace had been built in 1825, you may remember, by Alexander I. And that burned down in 1882, but on the site, the most luxurious hotel in the Crimea was built, and Brezhnev was a frequent visitor there, and he held meetings there with Willy Brandt and Richard Nixon. And further along the coast is the resort of Foros, where Gorbachev was held under house arrest. Do you remember this incident? During the attempted right-wing coup in 1991. And this is alleged to be the most prestigious dacha in the Crimea, now coveted by Putin, and therefore probably owned by him. And finally, during this whole period, Sebastopol enjoyed special favors as the base for the Russian fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, administered directly from Moscow. So in other words, even in the days of Ukrainian control, that little sort of enclave right on the southern tip at Sebastopol was administered directly from Moscow. And as a result, by the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, as a result of all these tourist influx and the improvement in agriculture and wine and so on, the population of the Crimea had once again topped 2 million. And it's possible that you might say that compared to other parts of the USSR, the Crimea had not come through the long ordeal of communism too badly. Now that applied, of course, to the Crimea, but not to all Crimeans. And in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan still lived 200,000 displaced Tatars. In 1954, some of the restrictions on their internal movement was lifted, which was a gesture with almost no benefits. And then in 1967 came the longed-for reprieve, when they were officially exonerated as a collective people of the charges of wartime collaboration. Now, naturally, they expected that they would now be allowed to return to the Crimea, but they discovered that that was not the case. In 1968, they staged a mass protest in Moscow, which was violently suppressed. and 10,000 Tartars who took the law into their own hands and tried to return to the Crimea were sent back immediately. It wasn't until 20 years later, in the perestroika era under Gorbachev, that real change came for the Tartars. In 1987, they staged another protest in Red Square, and they were allowed to make that protest unmolested. And 2 years later, and we're now reaching the very last years of the Soviet Union, 2 years later, they were granted a decree giving them the right to return to their homeland. And amazingly, within 5 months, no less than 155,000 had taken the opportunity to return to the Crimea. In 2001, the census recorded that there were 245,000 Tartars living in the Crimea, about 15% of the population, which an extraordinary revival in a matter of a mere dozen years. And the Tartars are very much a sort of international humanitarian scandal, and they always claim that they're the original rightful inhabitants of the peninsula. However, those of you who are still awake on Monday remember that long before the Tartars, there were the Greeks, the Armenians, the Karaites, the Ostrogoths, the Slavs, and dozens of other groups. And the Crimea is just one of a dozen places in the world where the question of original habitation is a very complex one. And the Tartars, of course, really only arrived in the Crimea in about the 14th century. They're actually relative newcomers to the area. And during the time that they were dominant, they didn't do much to develop or to enhance their property. However, that doesn't invalidate their claim to a share of the Crimea's future. They were always vulnerable, but they have not played their cards well. But by the dawn of the 21st century, which is where we're going to on Friday, they had staked their claim to a Crimean future again. Had the wheel come full circle, a spokesman for the Crimean Tatars said in 2001, "Let us hope we have had our last change of home and our last change of masters." Well, we know how that hope was carried out. Can I just say, before I finish, that the booklets that you have been asking about, did I mention this earlier? They are available now. And the handouts, are they there, Ryan? Are the handouts available? I mean, I think it would be seriously simpler if I just give the handouts to the people at the door tomorrow, and you can collect them when you come in. Thanks very much.